We are pleased to have the Australian Foreign Minister from 1988 to 96, and Gareth Evans with us today. Welcome, Gareth. My first question to you is, 2 years into the war on terror, the world is a more dangerous place. And why is that so?
Well, we're not doing particularly well in terms of fighting the war on terror. There's been more war and more terror and not much diminution of the phenomenon, which has come to alarm us because of the demonstration both of the capacity of small groups to do an extraordinary amount of damage, and our fear, which is alive and still very real, that we still haven't seen the big one, the combination of that terrorist commitment together with the utilisation of weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's a big question as to why we haven't done as well as we should have, but there's no doubt about the reality of that particular problem. There are two other problems which make the world a scary place as well. The second is the proliferation, or the imminent apparent proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and the disintegration really of the non-proliferation regimes, which have held together remarkably well for the last generation, in particular so far as nukes are concerned. And a third big problem is the problem of collapsed, failed, warring states, which are proving to continue to be not only a huge risk to their own people, but a source of concern to a lot of the rest of the world because of, in turn, their capacity to export other problems like terrorism, like health pandemics, like refugee outflows, environmental catastrophe, and so on. So when you look around, the world is not a particularly benign place at the moment, and we don't seem to have learned an awful lot about how to handle these various problems.
So you have outlined basically three types of problem that is endangering the world. One is, of course, the terrorism. Second is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, especially, I think, since the departure of North Korea from the NPT regime, and the threat that Iran might follow suit. And third is the disintegration and of states in many parts of the world, failing states and failed states. Now, let me start with the question of terrorism. Now, terrorist network is expanding, you have said it many times. Would you agree with the Indonesian President Megawati Soekarno-Putri, who just warned in the UN last week that the United States policy is increasing the alienation of the Islamic people from the United States and the West? Do you agree with that?
Well, terrorism feeds above all else on political grievance. It feeds to some extent on economic and social and cultural grievance, but it's only really when those kinds of grievances are somehow able to be encapsulated in people's minds in a kind of political framework, and it's only when there's seen to be an enemy out there that things start to get really dangerous. And it's only when, in that context, terrorists find that they have a broadly sympathetic community environment in which to operate, that the danger becomes really real of that being operationalized in terms of big attacks on soft targets, Western targets. And I think the biggest lesson we've learned, or should have learned, over the last little while that we've been alarmed about this, particularly since 9/11, is that unless you really systematically, seriously address those essentially political grievances are being seen to be taken them seriously, you're just not going to be able to confront effectively this phenomenon. In particular, you're not going to be able to create in the frontline states themselves, those where terrorist activity originates, you're not going to be able to create the capacity and the will to deal with this phenomenon. You won't have the capacity in governments to deal with it if they feel that their communities are not supporting tough action against terrorists. You're not going to be able to create, the will in the community at large to root out this phenomenon in their midst. We've seen it happening in the Palestinian occupied territory situation. We're seeing this now happening in Iraq, where a new set of grievances have come to fill a vacuum. We're seeing the potential for this to develop in a Southeast Asian context, although there I think one should not exaggerate the extent to which there are broadly felt senses of grievance. I think in a Southeast Asian context, the Indonesian context, is very, very much a minority phenomenon, and it is containable and controllable with sensible strategies. In the Middle Eastern context, it's a harder one to deal with because you've got the big unresolved political problems, Israel, Palestine and so on, that are just feeding this. And you've got the performance of the US in post-conflict Iraq feeding this. You've got the whole problem of the US dealing with authoritarian regimes in the Arab world feeding this. And until that feeding process somehow is reversed, we're going to continue to have a major problem.
So when you said the problem of US dealing with the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, you mean that the US support for this regime is generating some antipathy towards the United States? Is that what you are saying?
Well, of course, in the context of 9/11, we know that that issue was far more a motivator for the individuals immediately involved than any sense of general economic or malaise or any particular concern for the plight of the Palestinians. Here it was a real resistance to the US presence on the holy soil, which was of course linked to the whole long-standing US strategy of supporting and propping up regimes that were not particularly attractive to their own people. I mean, the issues are much too complex to simplify in a sentence or two, but what we have here is the fruits of a generation of policy producing results we're deeply uncomfortable with. And what we have to do is to recognise the necessity to address these underlying causes, not just focus on military action, not just to focus on punishment, not just to focus on finding the perpetrators, because you might be able to find them, but in the process you're breeding new generations to replace them, and that's the particular problem we're looking at right now.
You haven't mentioned Afghanistan, and it looks like the Taliban is coming back, kind of strengthened and resuscitated by forces in Pakistan. And what's your solution for that problem?
Well, it's a twofold solution. One is to get the act together in Afghanistan itself with a far more systematic and effective approach to governance and security within Afghanistan, and beginning with the effective spreading of the security forces beyond Kabul to all parts of the country, including the Pashtun areas, and associated with that the rapid delivery of aid, reconstruction, economic hope for these people, which is creating an environment, of course, in which hostile forces are once again breeding. That's so part of the answer is the internal one in Afghanistan that has not been handled particularly well. There's a hell of a lot more to do there to get it right. The other part of the answer is to be a lot tougher on Pakistan than the West, led by the US, has wanted to be. There's been far too much willingness to take at face value the protestations of support for the anti-Taliban cause, the anti-Islamist extremist cause, and not enough recognition that there are dynamics continuing to be at work within Pakistan that are giving a lot of aid and comfort to these forces, and there's a necessity to be much, much tougher about the way this military regime has been handling itself.
To move to...
So we've got a problem? Oh, and that's been rustling, or...
Yeah.
And that's... do you want to go back, or it's not too bad? Okay.
To go back to the question of the weapons of mass destruction, now the most immediate issue before us is North Korea and Iran. And on North Korea, what's your scenario? How do you think is going to happen?
Well, I'm some kind of optimist about the capacity for the North Korean situation to resolve itself, particularly if the neighbouring states, China in particular, can be held together and maintain a united front against the North Koreans. I think the North Koreans were rather shocked by the way in which they found themselves completely isolated in the first round of six-party talks a little while ago. It's necessary to adopt, as so often in these situations, a kind of two-pronged strategy, a willingness to be open and constructive and prepared to deliver something that the North Koreans want, which is basically security of their own, regime protection and economic support, but at the same time be prepared to be quite tough and to bring into play the prospect of further sanctions, the prospect ultimately of some kind of military strike, even though we all know that that's hugely dangerous. The worry about the way in which this issue has been handled by the US is there's been too much of the latter, the hard stuff, and not enough of the former. And
not enough carrots.
Not enough carrots, and we just have to hope, and I have some ground for confidence that this message is sinking in. We just have to hope that the negotiations, the discussions are handled in the period ahead in a way that gets both sides of the equation on the table. But North Korea is just a symptom of a larger problem of potential proliferation on a much more substantial scale of weapons of mass destruction. And what we have to ask ourselves is why this proliferation phenomenon is now coming to haunt us all over again. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that a number of these regimes are quite genuine, I think, when they say that the best chance they've got of not being attacked is to move quickly to have a nuclear capacity of their own. In that sense, the casual talk about preemptive strikes and that whole strategy that we've seen in work in Iraq has been quite counterproductive to the larger objective.
Just further encourage them to.
Well, it sounds too simplistic to put it that way, and it enrages policymakers in Washington if you even hint that this might be a problem. But you've only got to look at what these characters are saying in Iran and North Korea and elsewhere to realize that psychologically this is an important element in the gamesmanship, if you like, that's going on. And that leads me to the other main reason I think we're seeing this phenomenon. And again, it's largely psychological. It's the reaction of countries who say, why should we be put in a permanent second-rank status when the big guys, those who have weapons of mass destruction, have nukes under the existing nuclear non-proliferation regime and are allowed to keep them, when these guys are just not being serious themselves about even paying lip service to the objective of ultimate elimination. I mean, this was the big problem with India and Pakistan. Why did India acquire nukes? Well, partly they said for strategic parity with China, but that never made much sense to military people, and partly they said as a response to the anxiety with Pakistan, well, that made no sense at all from a strategic military perspective, because all they were doing was creating the great equalizer. Right. What it was really, really about was the psychology of permanent second-rate status, that you can't aspire to one of the badges of big guy status in the world. We're not going to let you have them. At the same time as the US and others making no gestures whatever to indicate seriousness of purpose for their own obligations under that treaty regime to ultimately eliminate. So the psychology of power and the position of the instruments of power is very much wrapped up in this, and we have to look long and hard at that.
Are we seeing the same thing in Iran, that Iran feels that since Israel is known to have nukes, that they have to have it? Is that?
Well, I think there's an internal debate going on in Iran in which that is one current that we have to acknowledge and recognize the reality of. I mean, this utter unwillingness in discourse about nukes even to acknowledge the reality of Israel's possession of a really quite formidable nuclear armory is just not helping movement on this issue. I mean, there's a lot of support within the Arab Islamic world for a genuine nuclear-free zone right across. And I mean, you could get very serious dialogue about achieving that result if only Israel was seriously in play as a potential dialogue partner and participant, but it's not. And so the whole situation continues.
So what are you going to see then? Is that do you foresee Iran pulling out of NPT like North Korea?
Well, again, I think that there's an awful lot of pressure on Iran, including internally from moderates within the country who are struggling, as in so many other spheres in Iran, to maintain some kind of position, and who do reflect, I think, majority community sentiment. I think there's a chance that we'll see an uneasy sort of resolution of this issue with IAEA inspections and optional protocols and so on being adopted and embraced, but with a continuing lingering anxiety that below the surface there is stuff continuing to go on. I think this is an issue that's going to trouble us for some considerable time yet, and it probably will only be in the context of a resolution of some of the larger political issues of war and peace in the region that we'll see a satisfactory resolution of this.
In your many sort of presentations, speeches, you have mentioned kind of three solutions to this growing crisis of security. One is that you said that there has to be institution, different rules, and different strategy. Now, if you could elaborate a little bit on that, the three aspects.
Well, what I've said is that, first of all, we've got to get our heads right about the relevant rules governing the use of force. The UN Charter at the moment is an incomplete Bible in this respect. It tells us that the Security Council can authorise military action when there are threats to international peace and security, but we're seeing increasingly the Security Council being bypassed as the gatekeeper for the application of that rule, countries going to war without Security Council endorsement, or perhaps alternatively not going to war when they should because of insufficient commitment to do that. We do have an absence of rules, in particular about the circumstances in which military intervention is appropriate for essentially internal situations where the wider international threat is of second order concern, and what you are concerned about is a threat to a country's own people as a result of government action or inaction or a total vacuum arising. And the problem of so-called humanitarian intervention and the rules that are to be applicable to govern that need a lot of thinking and talking through, because that's an issue on which the UN Charter is almost completely silent, except to say that value must be given to the sovereignty and non-intervention. So you really have a problem there. That's a big and a long one to resolve, but let's recognise it. Then you've got the institutional problem of the Security Council itself, not only its willingness or unwillingness to act in cases where it should or it shouldn't, but in particular the problem of the legitimacy of a Security Council which is manifestly constructed on the basis of the world as it was in 1945, not the world as it is now, but with the big guys retaining through their veto power the capacity to stop any change to that system to make it more visibly legitimate. And then you've got the problem of intelligence strategies. You can have all the rules in the world, you can have all the institutional structures in place to potentially enforce them, but unless you've got an intelligent approach to how you address these issues of whether it's terrorism or whether it's weapons of mass destruction or whether it's the problem of failed and failing states, unless you've got intelligent strategies in place, you're just not going to make the system work.
So where do you develop this strategy, if not the Security Council, which is, as you say, is becoming somewhat dysfunctional? At what forum or what mechanism is there for the countries of the world to come together, develop a common strategy?
Well, developing strategies is a function of national processes, is a function of regional and bilateral processes, is also a function of global processes. There's no magic wand one can wave to get intelligence being applied at all three levels. What we increasingly have to do, of course, is get people's heads around the idea that what they do at an international level is in fact very much a national interest, that you can't just distinguish between what happens out there and what happens domestically.
There's nothing local. There's nothing local.
Well, everything is ultimately local, and people have to realise that some of the global things we're concerned about here, and acting cooperatively in a global context, even on issues that don't seem to have an immediate feedback into the domestic political equation, nonetheless is a national interest. That international cooperation, good international citizenship, if you like, is a national interest, ranking out there with traditional strategic security, economic trade interests. Because in this globalised, interdependent world of ours, there are just so many problems which can't begin to be resolved except in the context of cooperative multilateral action. And the necessity to be cooperative with others on the resolution of their problems is a necessary prelude or precondition for getting cooperation coming back when my problem, your problem, comes on the table. Now, just getting that mindset going is a crucial part of getting better policies, better strategy. But beyond that, it's a matter just of debating the detail of these things. When we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, an intelligence strategy is one which says the existing nuclear powers should absolutely forswear the research and production of further generation nuclear weapons, because that is utterly unnecessary militarily and utterly counterproductive to the non-proliferation goal. We should also have a strategy which says the existing nuclear powers should much more clearly, explicitly, unequivocally commit themselves to an ultimate objective of elimination and sound serious about it, not half-hearted about it, because unless they do that, the psychology, the testosterone psychology that generates so much anxiety to play into this club elsewhere is going to continue. When it comes to terrorism, you've got to have a much more intelligent focus on a need to give preeminence to the resolution of the underlying political grievances. You've got to have much more preeminence and prominence given to solutions which focus on building capacity, building will in the frontline states. Now, again, all we can do is to hope that through existing national processes and international processes we can get more intelligent debate. Creating some new institutional structure or trying to, or hoping for some magic wand to be waved by someone to fix it is not going to happen. It's just an ongoing, nagging, gnawing process.
Terrific. Gareth, thank you very much.
Thank you.